Yeah, as Rich said, I'm doing my PhD at Royal Holloway. I'm in my third year of my PhD now. And yeah, the title of this talk is Energy, Industry and Therapeutic Landscapes, Exploring Health and Wellbeing in an Industrial Steelworks Town. Ew, why won't that move? Ah, there we go. So just an overview of this presentation. So I'm going to be looking first at a bit about the project background, then moving on to look at the site, and then how, hang on, I just need to move this. And then how my project overlaps between energy geographies and health geographies, then just an outline of the methodology, and then moving on to the kind of themes that I thought were relevant to this presentation. So the sort of overlaps between the topics, looking at energy, pollution and therapeutic landscapes, industrial experiences of trauma and therapeutic landscapes, the impact of industry on memory, identity and therapeutic landscapes, and then finishing off with some reflections, kind of final thoughts and ethical considerations. So yeah, a bit about the project background. I think it's important to convey how this project came into being, as I think this bit of personal background speaks to both energy and health geographies. I ended up choosing the site after conversations with my mum and my aunties, who all grew up in Wales, as they described going to stay in Port Talbot in South Wales with my great-grandparents who lived and worked there, and what it was like with my great-grandfather working at the steelworks there. My first cousin, once removed, has written about my great-grandfather in the family history, and I thought it would be nice to share with you an extract from this history to kind of outline the background. So this is basically him describing my great-grandfather's life in around the 1920s. So Anthony Hewlett worked as a doubler at the Baglan Bay Tinplate Works for 40 years. He walked 2 miles to his work near the dock, taking a few sandwiches and a bottle of cold tea or a small beer, made by his mother out of dandelions, stinging nettles, yeast and ginger. His work as a doubler meant he worked near the furnace from which hot sheets of steel were taken by a furnace man using long tongs. These were passed to him and he caught them with his tongs and doubled them over with his foot, which was encased in a doubling clog, a leather boot with a thick wooden sole edged with a steel rim. He became quite scorched in the face and his eyes suffered. His hands were blackened with burns and became sore, calloused and horny. Glycerine was applied to heal the burns and alleviate the soreness. One day the inevitable happened and he failed to catch the steel sheet thrown to him. The red hot metal cut and burned his leg very badly. He was taken to hospital but recovered remarkably well. There were many accidents in work, generally because dangerous machinery was not sufficiently well guarded. There were also the slow deaths suffered from diseases caused by the poisons generated by these heavy industries, which were not well understood at the time. The mines were especially dangerous. His uniform was a Welsh flannel short shirt which covered his body and upper arms. He wore old trousers held up with a belt and knee-length thick woolen socks. When he came home from work, his face was blackened and the whites of his eyes shone out. His short shirt, thick with dirt, was soaked in sweat. You could wring it out. He wore a clean, dry one each day. He bathed in a tin bath in front of the fire, and the order, "May you go and wash your father's back," was heard most days. But he did look lovely dressed in his clean clothes. All the works in the iron and steel industries were private companies, often family enterprises, each with their own rules and regulations and their own workforce, who were generally loyal and good workers. To summon their people to work, each had its own horn, hooter, or whistle. So at certain periods of the day, the village would be inundated with the cacophony of sound. I could recognise the sound of each work's whistle or hooter. The steelworks was 2 sharp whistles, which could be heard for 2 or 3 miles. If a worker failed to turn up at the right time, a man would be sent to his home. He would bang on the worker's door, shouting at the top of his voice, "Anthony Hewlett, why are you not at work?" This actually happened when my father overslept one night, and what a hullabaloo that followed. Mother didn't dare go out for a week for the shame of it, and we were chasing. All the works closed for 1 week in the summer. Most people saved all year to go on holidays that week, and new clothes were made for this highlight of the year. Where did they go? Not very far. Barry Island, Mumbles and Porthcawl were all very popular. We always went to mid Wales, like Aberystwyth, when we went into lodgings. The holiday in Llandrindod consisted of getting up early and going mushrooming, which we cooked for breakfast, then to the pump room for our drink of sulphur or chalybeate water. It was awful, but Father used to drink it and he said it made him feel better immediately. Then there was boating by the lake, playing bowls or taking long walks. In the evening, we played games or sang around the piano. He worked shifts, either 2 p.m. till 10 p.m., 10 p.m. till 6 a.m., or 6 a.m. till 2 p.m. He quite liked the 10 p.m. till 6 a.m. shift because this meant he returned home when we were all fast asleep. He lit the fire, boiled the kettle, and had a peaceful breakfast before the bustle of the house started. He was never at a loss for something to do. A week's work was about 40 hours, 8 hours a day for 5 days, with Saturday and Sunday off. Friday was payday and the men went to the office for their pay packet. Great was the day when Dad came in, put his pay on the table and said, "A 2-tenner this week, Betty." There were smiles all round. A 2-tenner meant he'd earned £2, 10 shillings, when he usually earned £2. After reading this account, I became intrigued with the harsh conditions of the steelworks and wondered whether there were still issues with health and safety. I was especially interested in the trips to mid Wales and my great-grandfather taking a drink of sulphur water, claiming it made him feel better immediately. I wondered what the people of Port Talbot and steelworkers there today do now for healing from the intense pressures of working life. I was very interested in how people living in this heavily industrial environment form their own therapeutic landscapes to cope with the conditions of work and also how they navigate the pollution in the landscape. So I decided to move to Port Talbot to conduct an ethnography. I lived there for 6 months and was back and forth for another 2 months after that. I wanted to reflect on my own auto-ethnographic experiences of living there and attuning to this very different landscape, and also on the experiences of steelworkers and local residents. The project builds on my undergrad and master's work, which also explored creative methods and ethnography in geography. So moving on to the site. So yeah, as mentioned, it's Port Talbot in South Wales, and it's home to the largest steelworks now in the UK and one of the last remaining. The steelworks has been in decline over the last 50 years. It was at its height around 1960 and 20,000 people worked there, and now this is reduced to about 4,000. Unemployment is very high, along with deprivation and drug use. The health of the area is poor, with a higher than average number of residents who suffer from long-term illness. The Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation suggests that the wards in the borough are among the top 25% most deprived wards for health in Wales. Neath Port Talbot also has the highest rate of death by suicide of any local authority area in Wales between 2013 and 2017. The final point on here, which is of course very relevant to both energy and health, is the high levels of air pollution in Port Talbot, as it suffers from some of the worst air pollution in the UK. This is due to its location sandwiched between the steelworks and the M4 motorway, which literally cuts over Port Talbot. If you've ever driven that way to South Wales, you'll know what I mean. Port Talbot also used to be situated between the steelworks and the very large BP chemical works, which was kind of like down the other end of the beach. So that was demolished in 2003, but yeah, the town used to kind of sit between those two heavy industrial sites. So yeah, this is just trying to map out different aspects of my work, which I think are kind of either health, energy, or both. I've tried to think a bit outside the box about the meaning of energy as well in relation to the project. But yeah, in relation to health, the project seeks to build upon the therapeutic landscape concept from health geography, which was first coined by Will Gesler in '92. He defined them as the physical and built environment, social conditions, and human perceptions which combine to produce an atmosphere which is conducive to healing. The early research often focused on extraordinary places of healing, like pilgrimage sites and spas, and moved to focus largely on green spaces such as parks, forests, and gardens. more recently, the concept has expanded to incorporate blue spaces, considering how histories of blue spaces have long-standing reputations for healing. For example, sacred springs, coastal retreats, and holy wells, where water drawn from these sacred sites was considered to possess healing powers. However, there's been a recent move to explore the more everyday therapeutic landscapes. So these include more urban grey landscapes like urban edgelands, cafes, and public libraries. The coloured categorisation of therapeutic landscapes has been defined as the palettes of place, and some studies have considered a blurred palette, considering the blues and greys of land, water, and urban interfaces. So as I put here, the project seeks to continue to challenge this perception that only green or blue landscapes are therapeutic, and that they're like intrinsically therapeutic to everyone. So yeah, it kind of challenges those assumptions and explores the different hues and colours of industrial landscapes, not just the visual aspect, but the sensory, felt and embodied experiences. And then it also experiments with creative methods in health geographies. So I use methods of storytelling, drawing, printmaking, to try to further engage with and understand the complexities of therapeutic landscape experiences. And then in the middle, is where I thought health and energy overlaps. So firstly, with how the industrial steelworks impacts everyday experiences in Port Talbot. So therapeutic experiences are being constantly impacted by the quality of the air and the steelworks output. So although therapeutic healing circumstances might arise in the landscape, we also have to take into account the quality of the atmosphere and what that's actually doing to our physical health. And then the impact of the heavy industry has also affected therapeutic experiences through physical and mental trauma from health and safety issues. So some of the steelworkers that I spoke to are experiencing ongoing PTSD after life-changing physical accidents. So those are kind of, some downsides, but also the industry has brought this incredible sense of identity and community spirit, which is quite unique to industrial areas. It's big feelings of pride, which are obviously very conducive to forming therapeutic landscapes. And then I just was thinking more outside the box on the energy side, and I started to think about sort of collective energy that's created between steelworkers, and especially I did walking for wellbeing walks, and there was a sort of effective charge coming together, and the strong sense of community kind of enabled these therapeutic landscapes for lots of people. And then I also thought, quite abstract, but about the energy of the wind and the waves kind of producing an atmosphere for healing. So it was often commented on that the impact of the elements was quite an immersive experience, taking people away from their sort of everyday lives. For some, it had the ability to clear the mind and provide some respite, really. So I thought these overlaps are really interesting, as clearly, my project has lots of links to both energy and health. Clearly that both those geographies shape therapeutic experiences in Port Talbot in lots of different ways. Just moving on to my methodology, which is basically split into 3 parts. So the first part is my auto-ethnographic explorations, which involved the whole process of moving there and living there and immersing myself in the landscape for 6 months or more. So I documented my experiences through field notes and sketches initially, and then I walked and swam daily in the landscape, and I used storytelling to kind of describe swimming in murky waters or walks on the beach amongst oil slicks in the sands, to try to describe the sensory and affective experience of adjusting to living in quite a heavily industrial landscape. So creative methods such as field sketching were crucial in this process. As Sage Bryce claims, it allows for an encounter negotiated at material, sensory, and affective registers, and can illuminate spatial and temporal relations. So it enabled me to understand and immerse myself in the environment, noticing other people's interactions more acutely and the weather and affective atmospheres. So as Harriet Hawkins has highlighted, drawing as a method is often not so much about the finished piece, but a process of engaging with placemaking, breaking down subject and object, immersing the researcher in the landscape. And then similarly, storytelling enables me to kind of convey the complexities of therapeutic landscape experiences, attending to atmospheric conditions and sensory and emotional embodied experiences. So that's, yeah, that was that part. And then the second part was basically looking at steelworker and ex-steelworker experiences, or generally, so I basically did ethnographic walking with a walking group. It was meant to be walking interviews, but it kind of evolved into just being like an ongoing ethnography as me becoming part of the group. I contacted the Marauders men's health charity in Port Talbot, which is a men's walking and talking group, which mainly attracts kind of steelworkers and ex-steelworkers. So after lots of ethics, risk assessments, initial meetings and interviews with them, I started walking with the group daily, mainly on the seafront promenade, but sometimes in the nearby mountains. The promenade was really useful as it was tarmacked and flat, so those with disabilities could often manage it with walking aids. The ethos of the group is to try and tackle the stigma surrounding men's mental health in Port Talbot, which was often commented on. And yeah, this part of the methodology sort of evolved from being interviews into just an ethnography where I was kind of trying to do voice recordings, but that was quite difficult on the very windy seafront. So it turned into kind of field notes, and also because it was a big group, it was hard to do individual interviews sometimes. So it was kind of a big process of just like becoming one of the boys, and yeah, it took a while to win their trust. As obviously I don't have a Welsh accent, and I'm obviously a girl, so yeah, there were lots of kind of interesting methodological challenges to that, but it was a really amazing experience. And then the third part of the methodology was interviews with local stakeholders, councillors, social prescribers, crisis teams, the Tata steel industry, basically anyone who was involved in any vague way with health and well-being in the town. I wanted to build a bigger picture of other contributing factors to health and well-being, so other kind of social and economic things going on. For example, I just wanted to find out more about Tata Steels. So that's the main, like, steelworks is owned by Tata, and I wanted to speak to them about their approach to health and well-being and stuff like that. So that was good. And then, yeah, so moving on to kind of the main themes that I'm going to talk about. The first one is the overlap between health and energy in regards to energy pollution and therapeutic landscapes. When I first moved to Port Talbot, as mentioned, I started off by trying to immerse myself in the landscape. I spent a lot of time kind of hanging out, I guess, like a form of participant observation, but using creative methods. So I experimented with walking and swimming in the landscape to see whether these practices were therapeutic for me there. And yeah, creative writing and storytelling to describe walking in these unexpected oil slicks on the beach, or swimming in all weathers in the sea, sometimes in murky waters, always with the steelworks looming behind me, with its otherworldly lights flickering across the ocean, either in the dawn or the dusk. So I often went like morning or evening. Drawing was useful as the field sketches required me to look carefully and see things differently, noticing the sensory aspects of the landscape. So I'd sit outside in all weathers and kind of try to get used to the ebbs and flows of like the steelworks outfits. So this sparked conversations with others in the town. One day I was sketching and a steelworker stopped to look. He noticed I was sketching the plumes of smoke, and he described to me the bangs and crashes you can hear from the steelworks at different times of the day. And he said, I could tell you what the smells are, where the dust is coming from, sometimes from the blast furnace, normally at about 5 o'clock at night, or sometimes just as it's going into dusk. You hear this boom, hell of an explosion. Well, not really an explosion, but a release of gas. You see a big black cloud, and I mean a big black cloud, coming across whichever way the wind goes. People complain, but I say, well, do you want us to blow up the blast furnace? So drawing kind of opened up these new and unexpected encounters, attuning me to like the different flows of industrial life. And similarly, I ended up like going to coffee mornings and like knitting groups and stuff in the town. And I'd speak to a lot of the ladies, and they'd often complain about like cleaning the dust off their cars, or having to bring the washing in at different like certain times every day. And it's kind of an interesting like rhythm to like kind of moving around the rhythms of the pollution and adjusting their like everyday lives to that. So it was interesting. I feel like living there gave me a different insight into that. And you can see here with one of my prints, I've experimented with printmaking. So it's quite useful to use colour to think through the different hues and palettes of therapeutic landscapes and how we might be able to represent that. Just kind of differing to the traditional blues and greens. I had a conversation with Sarah, a local resident. She agreed to have a chat with me as her husband Mike is in the men's walking group, and she wanted to tell me her experience of growing up in the area. We sat on the seafront on a bench overlooking the sea, with the steelworks to one side, pumping out the relentless streams of smog in hues of grey, black, browns and reds. We gazed out to the horizon as kids queued up for their ice creams. She tells me, I had cancer just before my 40th birthday back in '99, and I always put it down to being here, just like so many of my generation had it. Nothing in the family, so you're always asking questions. I sort of thought it was BP, as that was big when I was a little girl. Yeah, it was much more polluted then. I wonder if it was kind of a combination of living between the steelworks and BP. But you just can't prove anything, and now that's closed down anyway. But it just seems odd that there were so many of us. You think, well, was there something, you know? My father was a steelworker. He was a steel planner, watching the ingots. We had quite a good upbringing. We'd come down to the beach. Not so much my dad, though. They were doing shift work. So they were just recovering when they weren't working. I suppose they didn't know anything else, did they? But yeah, the cancer, I battled through it. And I always thought it was to do with where I live, because it was estrogen negative, my cancer. So it wasn't anything to do with my body. Nothing in the family at all. I was so young at 39, and you start thinking, while I had chemo, we buried a friend the same age for the same thing, battled for years, and then we lost somebody else. And my godson had cancer in the leg, which was really rare. And it was 3 boys in the town at the time with this rare cancer. And you start asking the questions and start thinking. I wonder even now, and I'm 63, there are still friends who are getting it. I don't know, it just seems to be a lot of people. Another friend has got blood cancer, and she asked the question. I mean, I know there was a lot of rubbish coming out of BP because you used to see it at night. It's gone now, but they used to let off a flare in the middle of the night, and you'd sit and see it, and the steelworks was dirtier than it is now. So you just ask the question, don't you? Is it something? It could have just been one thing, didn't like the other thing. We don't know, do we? You get that dust on your car and you just accept it because we live in an industrial area. We definitely talked about it growing up. In Baglan, we had a library with a car park opposite. And when we were younger in the 70s, you'd have a van there taking the air pollution. But I always used to say to them, why are you here in the middle of the afternoon? You want to be here 2 or 3 a.m. when they're burning that stuff off, which is right, isn't it? They never had accurate readings. So another thing is my mum had dementia. Her 2 siblings had it and the neighbours. They live in Margam behind the steelworks, and you sit back and think, that's strange. Was there something? You do just ask the questions. I don't think there's been any proper health studies, and you ask why. I've sat back and thought about it, and I think it's because they were both letting something off and they didn't like each other. I don't know, I haven't got a clue. I'm not a scientist, but it makes you think, was something not interacting well and we were breathing it in? I guess that was just my ticket, wasn't it? And I'm here now. I could have lived somewhere else and been fine, but then I wouldn't have had the upbringing I had, spending all my time down the beach or in the mountains. I don't know, it's just your ticket and you take it. I went to have my heart checked, as there's also heart problems in the family, and they asked me if I would call myself a blue collar. I said, yeah, I was brought up in a working class family. I have no problem with that. They did well for me. I just thought it was interesting he asked me that question. Like, why does it matter I'm from a working class family? Sarah's story is one that was also echoed in other stories, such as Martin's from the walking group. He's recovering from bowel cancer, and he said, yeah, it's one of those things that's in your subconscious. It's in the background all the time. It's not something you consciously think, oh God. I mean, you look at it sometimes and see black smoke coming out of it and all that crap, you know, but it's not something you consciously think about. I mean, we've talked in the past about the impact of the chemical works and whether or not that had a significant impact on cancer, for instance, in the area. And the general feeling is that it probably did. But I mean, a lot of people would say the steelworks has brought a lot of prosperity to the area, even though it's not seen as a prosperous area in terms of jobs. It's pretty good, really, isn't it? The tension between the recognition of the pollution and the potential health effects was normally coupled with the gratefulness of the jobs and prosperity the steelworks have brought to the area, as well as many participants commenting on the likelihood of their health conditions being related to their environment, although this was often followed by speculation with little evidence or certainty. Tom Davies builds on Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence, referring to toxic pollution as a form of structural inequality, arguing that not all toxic landscapes are invisible or out of sight to everyone. Through Tom's research in Louisiana and Cancer Alley, he reveals how inhabitants witness impacts of slow violence in their everyday lives. It's not that stories are invisible, but more that their stories don't count. This is how it felt listening to Sarah and Martin's stories, as well as others. I had a look into data on health and pollution, and I couldn't really find much supporting the link, apart from back when BP chemical works were up and running. There was a push for research from a local environmental group. In the 1980s, there was concern in Port Talbot for an alleged cluster of cancer, especially leukemia and larynx near the BP works. There was also concern over many deaths for both teachers and students in a nearby school. The results concluded that there was an excess of 8% cancer within the 7-kilometre radius, and 24% excess of larynx cancer was also found. After a conversation with a local artist who bridges art and science to create works which depict pollution data, he revealed to me some insider knowledge that Tata Steel apparently recently funded a PhD to look into the effects of the steelworks on pollution in Port Talbot. The artist explained that the PhD scientists he knew was able to prove the steelworks likes to blame the majority of the pollution on the motorway, but they proved conclusively that over 60% was coming from the steelworks. The PhD was sponsored by Tata, and when he finished the PhD, they just sat on the report, they didn't release it. I had a look at the thesis, and it concludes, so the artist kindly sent me the thesis. I'm not sure if I meant to have that, but and it concludes the health aspects of Port Talbot steelworks should be investigated. The scope of the study should cover the impacts of the steelworks emissions on the health of the workers and the residents. The study should also integrate hospital admissions with particulate and gaseous pollutant emissions. So what does this mean for therapeutic landscapes? So I just wanted to emphasize that I know that all sounds really negative, But the overall outcome of like all the walking for wellbeing walks and everything was that the members of the walking group, pretty much all of them, most of them were keen to highlight the huge effects that the walking group had on their mental health and well-being. So getting out in nature, even though it's kind of an industrial kind of nature, it's not maybe the nature that we'd all think of straight away, had a huge effect. Like, it really did save lives, whether that's through the community spirit or through just going out, seeing the horizon, the sea, the wind, the waves, even with the pollutants and the industrial background. Yeah, so I just wanted to highlight that the therapeutic landscape is very like complex in its layers. So even though people might feel better for their mental health, you have to consider the atmospheric effects as well. There's lots of tensions in whether it's good for your physical health as well. So yeah, the next kind of theme is industrial experiences of trauma and therapeutic landscapes. So I'll start this theme, which emerged from the research, with an insight into a conversation I had with Mal, who runs the Marauders Men's Health Charity. We were walking along the seafront towards the steelworks at the other end of the beach, its usual steam ribboning into the sky across the great ocean, and he asked if he could read me a poem he wrote one day after one of the walks with the group. Mal suffered from an industrial accident in 1999 at the steelworks. His leg was caught in a conveyor belt and he was told he'd never be able to walk again. He now miraculously walks on crutches, although he can't bend or move one leg. It's been a very slow recovery, but his PTSD and flashbacks have been the most debilitating, with the trauma surfacing into the present constantly, even 20 years on. He has explained to me bouts of severe depression, culminating in suicide attempts and hospitalization, as well as court trials and issues with Tata steel and compensation. Anyway, this is the poem he kindly said I could share. As my head spins with thoughts of fear, I watch the sunset on the end of the pier. Triggers set memories on fire. Of trauma I remember so clear. Huge machines on the harbour that turn for hour after hour. Belts which carry coal and iron ore. Memories I do not want anymore. 23 years now under control. PTSD, though, never leaves your soul. It keeps coming back in so many ways. Oh, I wish I could forget them days. A freezing wind, bitterly cold air. Freeze my mind, I do not care. Trivial things that try to break me. Sunset, please set my mind free. So I think this poem beautifully lays out the tensions in the industrial therapeutic landscape. As Mal explains, the atmosphere, wind, and the sunset freeze his mind, but paradoxically, the sight of the steelworks brings back memories and flashbacks of the traumatic accident. PTSD symptoms include persistently experiencing the traumatic event and can lead to other mental health problems like depression. In Alison Mounce's study on trauma, she describes how trauma can lie buried, but then affective eruptions move fixed sites of trauma to the surface. For example, affective eruptions arise through reading transcripts of interviews during the research process. The emotions erupt into the present moment and lodge into their new external home from one body to another. Similarly, Mal's trauma can unexpectedly erupt into his present experiences, reshaping his experience and whether it's therapeutic from moment to moment. It's also helpful to turn to feminist scholars' research on emotional geographies, like Gail Adams Hutchison's research into trauma in relation to emotion and effect. She uses the concept of the skin to explore barriers and containment of trauma, as trauma spills over these boundaries, exposing its fluidity. Gail's work focuses on post-disaster Christchurch, New Zealand. She outlines that traumatic flashbacks can fuse past with present and re-engage bodily senses in any time and place, remapping time and place onto bodies. Gail highlights how trauma, like in Mal's case, can fail to leave the body. It sticks to the skin, not only interrupting the everyday, but becomes embedded in the skin. As Sarah Ahmed also notes, skin can be seen as a record of trauma, an in-between space where trauma passes from interior to exterior, from the subconscious to the conscious, bringing bodily memory and present encounter together. Trauma transcends dualistic binaries of interior and exterior, mind and body. It is porous and effective. This is a useful framework in understanding Mal's oscillating experiences of the industrial coastal landscape as therapeutic. As on one level, the exposure to nature and the coast offers some respite, but it's more complex than that, as the steelworks also triggers these effective eruptions of traumatic memories, which spill over the boundaries of the skin, emotionally connecting self and landscape. How am I doing? Yeah, so I'm just going to touch on this theme, impact of industry on memory, identity, and therapeutic landscapes, because I'm not currently sure whether I'll have enough space to fit this theme in my PhD. But I think it's really important to the theme of this seminar series, as I mentioned before, like the industry really does create this unique kind of sense of place and community spirit. So everyone kind of, well, most people who I spoke to has kind of huge feelings of pride being a big industrial steelworks town. And also this kind of strong sense of nostalgia of a very kind of bright and prosperous past. So everyone has a lot of happy memories there on the beach and of kind of past life. And it kind of carries forward a certain form of hope, I think, in the landscape. So even though the future of the steelworks is still precarious, there is this sense of hope with the community spirit kind of coming together. Everyone knows everyone. It's just a very strong, like tight-knit Welsh community. So obviously that's very conducive to creating a therapeutic landscape if people feel supported, and especially with this walking group, because it brings people together and reminds them that they're not alone. So yeah, yeah, so that is that one. So just some final final thoughts, reflections, and just touching on some of the like limitations and ethical issues. So clearly, whether it's pollution, industrial accidents, or positive experiences of memory, identity, and industrial community spirit, energy and industry hugely shapes therapeutic landscapes in Port Talbot, adding to the layers of complexity and tensions in the landscape. There's a big crossover between energy and health geography in this project, and I think it's been really useful for me to actually think about it in this framing. And yeah, I'm just kind of currently reflecting on the difficulties I had with the research as well. I think going into the research, I was really naive with how intense it was going to be. Especially working with the men's charity. So yeah, I kind of dived in and I ended up struggling a bit with the divide between being a therapist and a researcher, as I think like the more I became, the more that they accepted me into the group, the more that they opened up and shared with me, which was amazing, but also a lot of the stories were quite traumatic and difficult to deal with. And I was quite worried about my limited knowledge of psychotherapy, with some of them coming to me with very serious mental health problems. So yeah, luckily my mum is actually a psychotherapist, so I'm actually looking at thinking about how we ended up sort of doing an accidental collaboration, because there were some situations which I didn't know how to deal with, being presented with, as I said, very serious issues. So my mum was actually able to help me in those situations, and also helped me deal with a lot of the stuff that I was kind of taking on and taking home. I was living there by myself, so I think there was some issues with lack of support and things which I hadn't really considered before I went and took on the research. So yeah, just kind of thinking about, and also the writing process now. I'm in the writing phase, and actually writing about some of these traumatic stories. I feel like these affective eruptions are kind of happening now, which is quite difficult to navigate as well. And then yeah, just issues with ethics of telling any stories, really. How am I telling them? Thinking about things like composite fiction and how you protect people's identity, and who am I as a geographer to be hearing these traumatic stories and then relaying them, how we use creative methods. The creative methods, sorry, someone's starting the engine outside. Yeah, I kind of also had this ideal vision of how I was going to use creative methods in the research. I thought it was going to be a kind of creative, participatory research method, but then that kind of went out the window as I realized how kind of vulnerable and sensitive it was working with some of these people, and actually just walking outdoors and talking was going to be much more achievable than being like, can you please draw me, or sit in a room and draw me your therapeutic landscape. Like, that just wasn't going to happen. So then that took on more of an auto-ethnographic approach. But yeah, so yeah, I'm sure we can discuss this more in questions, and it would be great to hear other people's thoughts and opinions. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. And any questions?
Thanks so much, Rosie. That was fascinating. Really, really interesting presentation, and I love the sort of the illustrations. I mean, really beautiful presentation. We've got some comments. I think mainly just people saying really interesting. Peter said really fascinating project, and enjoyed the overlaps between health and energy to explore. And the one that stood out to Peter in particular was the value of creative methods in energy geographies. And expanding the focus of energy to explore the embodied and effective energies, and thinking about the relations between energy and the toxic. So I don't know if you wanted to sort of, I mean, it's not really a question, it's more things that have piqued Peter's interest, but I don't know if you wanted to sort of say any more about those themes in particular.
Oh yeah, I think he's just said no.
Okay, good.
I can do. I think yeah, I think it's kind of interesting because I hadn't really thought about it from an energy perspective, although I guess I had without actually framing it like that. So yeah, it was just, I think, as I said before, it was kind of about trying to attune to this very like different landscape that I'm not used to. So literally like I think drawing forces you to like sit and stay in one place instead of just taking a photo. So whilst you're sitting and watching, you kind of notice the outputs from the steelworks more. Like, it would be different colors at different times of day, different noises. Like I said, like there's a certain time when they let off the output from the blast furnace at 5 o'clock every day, and that's quite a big like crash bang like explosion type thing. So yeah, I think it's becoming, the creative methods help me sort of, and then playing around with printmaking and things like that, like really thinking about these different colors and things. It's still like an ongoing process, I think, reflecting. And also as well, I don't think I mentioned, it ended up being like a therapeutic landscape for me almost as well, because obviously I mentioned it was quite a lot to, I was a bit naive going into it of how much it was taking on this men's mental health charity, and the creative methods ended up being a bit of a therapeutic landscape and coping mechanism for me as a researcher there as well. So that was a bit of an unexpected finding. So yeah, I think creative methods had a few uses.
That's really interesting. I can see Peter's raised his hand, but if anyone else wants to ask questions, please use the sort of raise hand function, drop questions in the chat, or feel free to sort of jump in if you have a sort of burning question. Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Rosie. And I'm going to be quick because I want other people to ask questions rather than me. But yeah, I thought this was absolutely fascinating and really interesting, given that I've literally just come back from a field trip in South Shields, where we've been looking at post-industrial landscapes. And it's a very, very similar situation in North Shields, where a place that has experienced over the last 50 years like significant deindustrialization and is now coming to terms with that. And it was just very striking just how similar a lot of the challenges were here to the ones that we were talking about today. So I guess my question here, if there is one, is about the specificity of Port Talbot, and I guess kind of, is there anything, do you think there's anything kind of unique about Port Talbot in this, or is this a lot of these issues kind of common across kind of industrial and post-industrial towns, particularly coastal towns? I mean, I was actually struck as well by a few years ago we went to a place called Puchuncaví in Chile, which has had very similar issues with a huge kind of increase in cancer rates due to industrial processes there. There's, if you're interested, look up the green men of Puchuncaví, who are literally turning green in their insides, which is horrendous. But yeah, so is there anything specific about Port Talbot? And secondly, just to put a little bit of energy, a different energy concept in there. One of the concepts that we've been using on this course is the idea of carbonscape, and the idea here in the carbonscape being that there are certain forms of durability or kind of like lock-ins of different ways, and there's a danger of maybe overemphasizing those forms of durability. But with my students, we've been exploring, well, what stays the same and what leaves, or what leaves and what remains, right? And what aspects of these landscapes remain durable, what disappear, and so on. And I wonder whether kind of you've given that any kind of conceptual thought in your studies. Thanks.
Oh, thank you for that. Just on that second one, did you mean like when you say what stays and what leaves, as in like when it goes into if it does goes into the post-industrial phase, or like actually atmospheric, what stays and leaves?
Literally both. Like, so what is left behind after how poisoned are these environments? Or what industries have stayed here? Who stays here? What kinds of infrastructure stay here? How do those kind of remnants come together with kind of present day arrangements to create certain legacies? And I guess, I mean, you have been thinking about this type of stuff. I just wondered whether, like, how you'd been thinking about it, and how in the back of my mind how it helps us to maybe think about these post-industrial landscapes in different ways. So yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, really good questions. The first one, yeah, no, I'm not surprised there's lots of overlap. I feel like Port Talbot's probably, yeah, resonates with a lot of kind of industrial towns. I think it was interesting to me because I felt like there had been quite a lot of work on post-industrial, or not a lot, but like a bit of work on post-industrial kind of therapeutic landscapes, or post-industrial kind of sites and well-being. So I thought it was kind of cool that Port Talbot is still like up and running steelworks town, although very much reduced, and yeah, the future is I think quite precarious. So yeah, and also the fact that it's coastal as well. I think, yeah, I think that's obviously a really, really beneficial for a lot of the local residents who make a lot of use of that coast. So obviously the men's group literally uses it like every day. And even though it's got the steelworks to one side, Aberavon is like a lovely beach, really sandy, and has like the best sunsets. So a lot of the residents literally come down just to watch like the sunset, or like walk their dog on the beach. And also I feel like it must help a lot with pollution as well, being by the coast and kind of not landlocked. But yeah, I'm not a scientist, but I imagine that was yeah. And then yeah, I think it probably does suffer from a lot of things, yeah, social and economic issues that other industrial steel moving into the post-industrial phase suffer from. So the high levels of drug misuse and deprivation and things like that. I imagine that's not that unique, sadly, but yeah, I think also the strong Welsh community spirit, like it just seems like, obviously from living there and stuff, I mean, I've lived in Bath and now in London, and it was just like, I just couldn't believe the strong sense of community. Like everyone knows everyone, like literally they know all about each other's families, they help each other out all the time, and they're like constantly singing like these Welsh songs, like their accent's so strong that you can like hardly understand them. So yeah, there just seems to be this really strong spirit, and there's just a lot of, even though they could have got into negative loops, and obviously some of them do, but in that moment, in that therapeutic landscape of the walking group, there was, you know, there's this big sense of hope and looking to a brighter future. So I think that was maybe quite unique, I don't know. And then yeah, thinking about the moving forward and what might happen to the steelworks if it does close, and kind of the remnants of the past. Like obviously the BP chemical works closed down, and I'm pretty sure that land is now sort of out of use. It's too toxic to do anything with. So yeah, you do have to think about like how these things do scar the landscape. But then I guess like if that did happen, then I don't know, you'd have to think about how they could keep the pride of the landscape. Like a lot of the pride is linked to feeling the huge sense of identity with the steelworks. So I guess you'd have to think about how they can try and carry that forward if the steelworks wasn't actually up and running. So yeah, lots of, but they're talking about decarbonisation with the steelworks and looking to green steel. So there's talks about that, but it sounds quite hopeful. But also very hard to achieve and very expensive. So fingers crossed. Yeah, hopefully that vaguely answers those. Thank you.
Great question and great answers. There's a few hands up, which is exciting. I saw Elspeth's first. So Elspeth, do you want to jump in? Oh, we've lost you. I don't know if you
Yeah,
muted.
sorry. Thanks so much for really. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Sorry, I've got an unstable connection. Thank you so much for a great talk. It was fascinating. I was just really struck by what you were saying about this sort of interesting contrast between landscapes on the one hand being simultaneously toxic and therapeutic. So you've got people walking in an atmosphere which is a toxic atmosphere, but they're doing so because it has beautiful sunsets, which are probably beautiful because of all the pollutants in the atmosphere. And this interesting contrasting or contradictory thing where I was just wondering how people, sorry, I'm not explaining myself very well. How do people navigate a landscape that's on the one hand toxic and on the other hand, they're using it therapeutically? So are they, for the men's walking group, knowing that they're walking through toxic air, but they're doing so because of the sense of community that they have, do they rationalize that in any particular way? For example, through having different temporalities. So my immediate emotional needs are more important than my long-term exposure to pollution. Or are there other kinds of rationalizations that are emerging, perhaps with seen and unseen therapeutic aspects, so they can see the person that they're walking with, and they have an emotional affective response, but they can't see the pollutants necessarily. So I was just wondering what's going on there to enable them to kind of navigate that tension.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah, it's a very very difficult like tension to try and it was hard to kind of try and research that as well, because apart from those stories that mention the stories of cancer and things, mostly when you ask steelworkers or the men that came to the groups, if they were concerned about the pollution, they kind of like, it was met with like, oh, what are you on about? like that's not something that I'd ever think about. So yeah, I think it is kind of just that's all they've ever known. So they often comment, well, I was born here, like my parents did well here, like why would I live anywhere else? Like we're so lucky to have the steelworks in the industry. So I just, yeah, I kind of got the sense that it was weird to me going there. So it's my positionality of having not lived in a industrial environment, but for them it was just part of their everyday. And I think is it Lauren Berlant who wrote Crisis Ordinary, and it just becomes like part of your ordinary everyday kind of negotiation of that becomes part of your therapeutic landscape. So yeah, although we might see that as like, oh god, toxic landscape, like can't be good for you. Yeah, and I think in a way for some of them it felt like the when I say, wow, look, it's pumping out a lot of steam and black smog today or something, they'd be like, oh yeah, like isn't the steelworks great, like long may it continue kind of thing. So it's kind of like a reminder in a way of like, unless obviously like Mal's story with the industrial accident and his ongoing PTSD, but then even for him I was shocked with how like fondly he would also speak of the steelworks. So I feel like it just kind of like, it's just it's the identity of the town, it's the symbol that everyone associates with it. And a lot of them would say, you know, they would never want to live anywhere else, or most of them, they'd make a point of saying, well, I don't even want to go on holiday, like this is just, you know, this is great. And not everyone, but there was definitely stories like that coming through. So yeah, it's a hard one to get your head around and to try and research. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Clifton.
Hi, Rosie. Thanks. I'm doing same sort of work up in Teesside on the northeast coast, which is pretty much like Port Talbot, and then and in Fukushima. So lots of sort of really nice to hear that I wasn't some of the things you're finding. There's sort of nice confirmation. It's lovely. And by the way, your prints are amazing.
Oh, thank you.
But just wondering, you've spoken with these communities and you're walking with the men, and there's lots of reference to air pollution. And you mentioned, you know, it's like both Port Talbot and Teesside, they're coastal places. And you mentioned swimming. I came in a little bit late to your talk. So one of the big things, I spent a lot of time in the water, using creative methods in the water, and water pollution and toxicity and die-off and crustaceans and all this sort of stuff. So could you tell me a little bit, what's with the water, how's the water fit with the therapeutic landscape? Because often we talk about therapeutic landscapes, not therapeutic seascapes and all this. And these are, I don't know what it's like in Port Talbot, but around Teesside, we have a major issue at the moment. It's major die-offs. We've got dredging, we've got a free port coming in. There's lots of politics going on, and we're getting sick. Like we go in the water, we get sick. And we both use that pollution to keep others away, because the therapeutic landscape can be ours. But yeah, just the water, I'm just curious what they've said, or whether you've been swimming in the water and whether that gives a different take on the matter.
Yeah. Oh, wow. No, yeah, your research sounds so interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, the water actually is, well, I was going to also do research with swimming groups down there. So that was originally part of my methodology, but then the walking group became such a massive, huge like thing that took over my life. So that kind of didn't happen, but I included it still as part of my auto ethnography, because I, as well as like walking in the air, I also wanted to attune to things going on in the water. So yeah, attuning to those everyday kind of differences. And again, it also ended up being part of my own kind of therapeutic landscape of coping, of living there and doing the kind of research I was doing. So I ended up doing that, you know, the cold water swimming that everyone's like gone crazy about. So and also my family stories, like my mum, she has stories of swimming in those same waters when she was a little girl, and literally emerging from a day at the beach like with oil tied slicks around her neck. So I was kind of interested to see if that had changed, and like that didn't happen to me, but the water definitely wasn't clean. And from the I was looking at kind of the reports every day before I went in, and it was getting like 1 out of 5 stars on the like pollution chart in the water. So that wasn't great. And then yeah, just a lot of kind of slicks and foam going in. There's often really didn't look clean, and a lot of like speculation about what the steelworks dumps into the water. And there's like, I'd hear some horror stories from the men about these like mutated fish they claim they've like seen, but I don't know whether that's true at all. So yeah, it was kind of these stories. Yeah, I don't think it's great, but yeah, the swimming was meant to be a group thing, and then ended up just being me basically. But I thought it was very important for me to have that like different immersive aspect, because like, as you know, like going in water is probably like the most immersive thing you can do, I feel. So then yeah, still thinking through kind of how I'm framing that with like feminist approaches of like watery cultures, and thinking through the skin and things like that. So yeah, thank you so much. It's such a brilliant question.
Fantastic, really, really great question, and thank you, Rosie. It was lovely to hear that. Really, I mean, you paint such a rich picture of the place and the people that you've been working with. Do you have any other questions at the moment? If not, I've got many, although I'm sort of conscious of time and that we're really sort of grilling Rosie here. But I suppose actually it sort of builds on your response to Clifton actually, and you're thinking about you. I mean, I think what I really enjoyed about your talk is how much this moves from that kind of very early concept of Will Gesler and therapeutic landscapes, and a lot of the 90s scholarship on therapeutic landscapes. You so much of it based on that kind of almost wilderness and pristine nature spaces to really think about these kind of really complicating the areas that we think of as therapeutic spaces, and the really relational composition of these spaces. But I'm it's perhaps a niche question, but I'm fascinated by human-animal relationships and health and well-being. And I guess I was kind of wondering if you had any thoughts on how the industrial landscape affects the potential for sort of human and animal encounters, and how that reworks opportunities and limitations for, I suppose, therapeutic landscape experiences. I mean, you just mentioned these sort of hypothetical, maybe not hypothetical, mutated fish and things like that. So I'd love to hear any more stories of animals in those landscapes as well.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting actually. Yeah, it's not something that I've massively thought about, apart from like hearing the crazy like fish stories. But I love animals, so I kind of wish there was more wildlife. I tried to interview conservation groups and things around there, and it just, yeah, it sounded like they were just at a point of like despair in a way. Like they were just really sort of saying that you know, Tata steel polluted the environment and they don't know what to do about it, and there's not really any funding or help. So they, yeah, I don't know, they just seemed a bit of a loss with it. which was a shame. And they're really trying to do something about it, but it just seems like they're sort of going against the tide with it a bit. I would also swim like down across the bay in like Swansea or Mumbles, and often like end up swimming like very near to seals. But then I never came across any seals or anything on Aberavon Beach. So you do wonder whether that's anything to do with the steelworks, because surely wildlife would prefer to go across the bay where the water might be cleaner. So yeah, I think it does affect like human, non-human encounters. And I can't say I ever saw any fish or anything because the water's pretty murky as well. So who knows whether they're mutated, but people do fish there. Maybe I should speak to the fishermen. Yeah, so yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. Mal, who runs the charity, just thinking outside the box, he always brought along his dog Cara, who's sadly now passed away, but she basically started up the group. Mal would be out walking with her and pick up some friends along the way, and then they registered for a charity and turned it into a walking group. But Cara was like the heart and soul of the group, really. Everyone loved Cara, and she'd know when someone was upset or down because she'd be right there by their side. So I think there did end up being a bit of kind of animal therapy as well in that group. So yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I think I need to think more about that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for indulging my sort of niche interest. Yeah. Are there any other questions, or is it worth bringing this to a close? I mean, I don't know if you want to sort of skip. Did you have your email on your opening slide, Rosie, just so that people have it in case they want to follow up with any other questions or queries? I'm sure Rosie would be happy for people to sort of get in touch with more questions and continue the conversation that way.
Yeah, definitely. I'll just put it in the chat because I'm not sure if I put it on.
Great. But thank you everyone who's joined us today, and again a huge thank you to Rosie for the sort of opening this seminar series with a really fantastic presentation. It's no sort of small thing to be the first person to speak in a seminar series, and I think we've been blown away by what a fantastic presentation it was, and lots of food for thought, and it's been great to have this discussion and series of questions afterwards. So if you are interested, we will be continuing with the Health and Energy seminar series next week on the 10th of March, again at 1 p.m. GMT, with a presentation from Dr. Elisa Schramm from the University of Vigo, talking about thermal discomfort in Catalan eco-communities, affects, bodies and repetition, and you can sign up for that either on the Geographies of Health and Wellbeing website or the Energy Geographies website that I linked earlier. So yeah, please do join us next week or some of the preceding weeks. We're going for the next sort of 7-8 weeks in March and April, and we look forward to joining you. But again, can I just thank Rosie for a fantastic presentation, and just really wish Rosie all the best with the rest of her research and writing up what is a really interesting topic. And I hope that we get to see more of this in press soon, and a place for these wonderfully rich prints and illustrations too. So I think with that we'll probably close it, but thanks again everyone for coming along and for everyone's contributions.
Oh yeah, thank you